Hi everyone. With this particular video, I wanted to discuss something that was on my mind recently and haven't really talked about before, in part because it's all at once fairly new and not very new at all. And I thought I'd try this while having a little music playing in the background. The album is Hellfire Reckoning. It's really good. You should go and support the artist. The links are actually in the description here. You can order the CD. There's the downloading and streaming on their website, it looks like, and it's honestly just an awesome band. What I wanted to talk about, though, isn't actually related to them. I just thought, well, I'll have something playing in the background, and I love listening to metal, and bands like these tend to be a little more obscure, so this is like new wave of traditional heavy metal type stuff, and they're really awesome. And having sat down and listened to the new Metallica single, and everybody's focusing on that because Metallica's a neoliberal band. They control and privatize a lot of exposure and just have a lot of access to capital. So they of course, are the talk of the town. But I think a band like Hellfire is a million times better than them, but also a million times less well known. So go support the band. They're awesome. As far as what I wanted to talk about, I wanted to talk about being autistic and being trans, but also not really having a language for it. And what I mean by that is, while I felt queer or trans when I was younger, I didn't necessarily have the language to describe how I felt. This is a very common feeling, and it's something that's shared amongst various people in the LGBTQ community. And when I use the word queer, or I use the word like gay or trans, they do have more specific definitions, but oftentimes conversationally they get used interchangeably. So if you could say queer, you could say genderqueer, you could say trans, transgender, gender fluid, and there are various expressions like that you could say gay, and I feel gay, I feel queer, I feel trans, and they tend to conversationally basically mean the same thing. It's not to say, again, that they don't have specific definitions, but I'm using them in the more basic sense. So, like, for instance, gay is the orientation, the sexual orientation, whereas transgender is a gender identity, and queer can pertain to like genderqueer, or not adhering to or deliberately combating gender norms, something like that. So queerness, it's also a reclaimed word in the same way that gay is, where gay originally, at least in the 1950s, meant happy, and then it meant it was more of a slur against homosexuals, while homosexuals were using it themselves. And nowadays, I'd say in like fourth wave, like feminism and genderqueer theory, stuff like that, it's used in a more reclaimed kind of way. So gay, queer, that kind of thing. Yeah, actually, they mean different things, but so I'm only bringing this up because this music is good. I'm bringing this up because some people might hear the terms and wonder what they mean. So I'll try and just stick to one particular term, but I might slip up. So I am out as a trans woman now, and I have been out since August, and I it was a decision that I made recently to come out, but amongst my friends, I have been increasingly queer over time and feeling that way increasingly as time went on. And yet, at the same time, I have to turn the music down. I love this music, and I want to promote it, but I almost can't focus. I've never tried this before, so I almost feel like I should just put something chill on instead. Let's do this. Jazz Sabbath. I don't know if this will be any better, because I still might get distracted. So, in terms of me being trans, and in terms of me being neurodivergent, these were things that generally had to be pointed out to me because of where I grew up. I grew up in a small, mostly white town in southeast Michigan, and I wasn't really around anyone that wasn't quote-unquote normal. And politically, my mom's side of the family are what you would call liberals or liberal Democrat, that kind of thing. And my dad's side of the family is more conservative or Christian, more traditional. And regardless, my mom divorced my dad when I was 10, and I was mostly around my mom's side of the family as a result. It was court ordered, but also we just didn't want to be around dad for various reasons. And my mom's side of the family was more left-leaning, relatively speaking, being against racism in the abstract. Yeah, I support Martin Luther King, but perhaps just not being very politically engaged to the point of understanding how left-leaning or leftist politics actually work in practice, and how you go from supporting something in the abstract to supporting it in practice. A similar idea would be, I believe the Palestinians have a human right to return, but not a physical or a material right to return. And you hear that come up a lot. It's a moderate kind of argument where you have people who are making concessions with pro-Zionists in Israel, where they're like, yeah, I'm against apartheid in the abstract, but I just don't think it's realistic to bring all those Palestinians back and give their stolen land back to them. That kind of thing. So my family politically would be kind of like that. We're against racism. In the abstract, the white moderate was someone to fear, according to Martin Luther King, who was a practicing communist and who believed in reparations, affirmative action, things like that. And the reason I'm mentioning that is my family ostensibly was less conservative and less traditional than my dad's side of the family, but I still grew up in the same town as my dad's side of the family, and I went to the same school as all of the conservative kids and all of the kids who, politics wasn't really something that I thought about in the 5th grade, but the fact of the matter is, I still was exposed to it in school, the teachers and the curriculum and what they chose to teach. Some teachers were a little bit more left-leaning than others. I had a teacher in, I want to say in high school, maybe my freshman year, and I can't remember his name now, but he was a Beatlemaniac, and he loved the Beatles, and he would talk about them all the time. And it's kind of difficult to talk about the Beatles without talking about John Lennon. Songs like Imagine a World Without Nations, I Wonder If You Can, or Borders, or Politics, Material Possessions. So there's definitely a political angle. I had another teacher, Mrs. Ott, who also in high school, who loved Black Sabbath, for instance, so Jazz Sabbath here, and they would talk about the politics behind Black Sabbath. War pigs. Why do they always send the poor? and that kind of thing, which, in my generation, you had System of a Down, who was kind of emulating that anti-war mentality with the terror war waged by the United States against the Middle East, and, Afghanistan, Iraq, that kind of thing. BYOB, why do they always send the poor? They depend on your protection, and yet they feed you lies from the tablecloth, that kind of thing. I might be getting the lyrics wrong, but in any event, System of a Down was political, and that was very much the politics of high school. But even before high school, like in K through 12, like when I was a little kid, in elementary school, I was still being exposed to various things that I didn't really recognize, but that I was connecting with more intuitively, or rather I was feeling cognitively estranged from, even as a kid. Like I felt like I didn't fit in, and I had a very, very high reading level. For instance, in the 3rd grade, I had a college level reading level, and I was interpreting and reading things in a way that was highly unusual for my age group, and I was thinking about things very precociously. So for instance, I now primarily write about sexuality. Well, in the 5th grade we had a sex ed class that talked about the nuts and the bolts, so to speak, the birds and the bees, the sexual reproductive side of things. And they didn't really go into anything else, like how to have like a healthy emotional relationship, how to relate to people. They always leave that out. Instead, if you're lucky, you'll get a talk about how, our bodies function and what puberty is, and maybe prophylactics and safe sex. That's about it. And it's hard enough getting schools to teach that kind of thing in the curriculum, but that's that moderate side, that liberal side of my early childhood education sort of showing through. And I remember really gravitating towards that even as a kid, and just being like, oh wow, this is really interesting. Though to be fair, I actually had earlier exposures to sex where my dad would leave the pornos in the VHS tape player, and he would pause them like in the middle of a scene, and then I would go and push play on the player thinking that it had, I don't know, Flight of the Navigator or The Gnome Mobile or The Last Unicorn. These are all movies I watched when I was a kid, and they ripped them off the television using the record function on the VCR player. And instead of getting those movies, I got a porno, specifically the sex scene in a porno, no less. And I was like 4 or 5 when this happened. So I was very much not totally innocent when it came to this kind of thing. And by the time I was being shown the birds and the bees, sexual reproduction in the 5th grade, I was already going to my local library and checking out books and reading about sexuality, and I was just very interested in it. But I also, at the same time, had a difficulty relating to people. I didn't have a lot of friends growing up, and even now I have a handful of friends that I could count on, 2 hands, which I think is actually a pretty good number. And to those to whom your adoption is tried, bind them to you with hoops of steel. The idea, if you got friends, fucking hold on to them, right? And if you can have even 1 or 2 really, really close friends, like Samwise was to Frodo, Master Samwise, that's actually really, really good. I mean, I'm 36 at this point, and all of my experiences have taught me. I've had friends come and go along the way, sort of fair weather friends who don't really stick through the harder times, through thick and thin, come hell or high water. And if you have a friend that can stick with you throughout the good and the bad times, that is something you do not want to surrender. You do not want to just let go and be like, oh well, whatever, I don't care about that. It's really, really valuable. That being said, I didn't start meeting friends like that until the internet came around. And actually after the internet. I was in the 5th grade in 1995, so middle school after that. I didn't start attending high school until the year 2000. 2001, you have the War on Terror, and then I graduated in 2004, and the mentality of the time was very much, I grew up with a bunch of white boys who loved guns and were very cishet. And for instance, I love science fiction, and we watched in Mrs. Brown's science fiction class in high school. I think I took this class when I was a senior. We watched Alien and we watched Aliens because they're super different movies. And one of them is hella gothic and very much a neoliberal critique. And one of them is not. It's still kind of gothic, but it's literally Red Scare propaganda, a Vietnam War revenge fantasy. So Aliens is by James Cameron. It's very much the space bugs are communists in the same way that Heinlein treated them as in Starship Troopers. The pseudo-arachnids, Heinlein called them, and the idea was fight the Chinese with nuclear bombs, nuclear war. Well, what did Ripley say in Aliens? I say we take off and nuke the site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure. And very much how Americans treat other people through foreign policy. And Aliens basically revived a pro-war sentiment against communists that could be sort of retooled against other groups that are being genocided against by the United States, by American neoliberals and fascists alike. So when the terror war happened in the United States, that was the kind of thing that kids of my generation thought. They loved aliens, they loved guns, and they were all very, very cishet. And they were all very, very not neurodivergent, not autistic, not on the spectrum, and normies, that kind of thing. And it's not to say that you can't have someone who's gay and pro-war. You can have a neocon or a neoliberal who's all about the war in the Middle East and, peace through force, that kind of thing. But the point being is that I was very much someone who was anti-war and someone who was trans, very much in my trans egg. It hadn't hatched yet. But I was also very, very much on the spectrum, but didn't realize it until later. And that's where having friends, my people, comes in. The old expression, blood is thicker than nectar, doesn't really apply if you're on the spectrum and you're trans, because you can have parents who aren't neurodivergent and give birth to a child who is, and that can create a lot of problems. You can also have parents who are cishet. My mother, for instance, is very much sex positive, very trans accepting, and that's good. And they got their own thing going on upstairs mentally, but they're very different than me in terms of politics. For instance, I am an anarcho-communist. They are not. And it's very, very much reflected in our generational differences, because in 1991, during the fall of the Soviet Union, they went to Russia and they studied it very much from a neoliberal Western lens, as in Russia bad, United States good, that kind of thing. Whereas I'm not an apologist for Stalin or something like that, but I do see the Soviet Union is generally something that's framed as the monster in Western propaganda, when in the same breath I'll look at the West and how it frames itself during something like the War on Terror, which lasted for 20 years. And during that war, there were just a lot of things happening in regards to how normie kids around me felt about it and how they performed in terms of their genders and how they functioned as non-neurodivergent people. And it's really difficult for me to explain any of this without being very intersectional and without treating everything as sort of like a web or a constellation of different points, because this is literally how I think. on a day-to-day basis. And it makes me very good at like seminars, or just the gift of the gab, as a friend called it. But it is something that I think takes a bit of adjusting if you're not used to my style. And, you know, if you're not able to follow along, I totally understand. But it's one reason I'm sort of talking like this is because, well, it's just how I think. And I was literally just sitting at my computer and thinking, I wonder why, after graduating high school, the friends that I started to make, a lot of them were trans, a lot of them were autistic, and they would tell me this without prompt. And then I thought, okay, well, let me think about it. And then I was like, I know what I should do. I should totally do a video about this, you know, and just tell people it. My point of view, what's it like to be trans? What's it like to be neurodivergent? And now that I have it set up so that I can record a little bit more easily, you know, the lighting is a little bit better, I can do thumbnails, I don't have to really do any editing and still produce a video that's at least semi-coherent, then, yeah. Fuck it. Let's just sit down and tell the world how we feel. And it's relevant in my case for a variety of reasons, just because of the war going on in the Ukraine, but also because I'm writing about, you know, being someone who primarily writes about sexuality and gender identity and performance, and also someone who is starting to learn, I think I am actually autistic on the spectrum. To what degree I can't say, but it actually makes a great deal of sense. And while I always felt like I didn't fit in, I never really had the language to describe that in terms of my gender and my sexuality, and also just my intelligence and the way that I thought about things, the way that my brain functioned. And I, again, was like this in like elementary school, and it made it very, very difficult to make friends, and for both of those reasons. So me coming to terms with that and finding the language, because it's not something that you just come up with on your own. You acquire language, right? You learn language. It's all around us, and when something applies to us, it's easier for us to sort of adopt it and be like, yeah, this is me. And part of that, accessing that kind of language, is having friends who are able to talk to you honestly and help you learn more about yourself. And I am lucky to have a handful of friends that I mentioned before that I've had for a long time. I have one friend in England that I've known for 11 years. I met someone in 2014 that I've been friends with, so that's 8 years. I have someone that I met in grad school that I've been friends with for 5 years, and other people as well. You know, my friendships tend to last a long time. I don't have as many friends, but my friendships are close, and close to the degree that I can be myself. These are my people. They're not my family, because again, my family, they're a bunch of cishet liberals on my mom's side and a bunch of Christian conservatives on my dad's side, and I never really fit in with my dad's side at all. And my mom's side, my grandparents grew up, they grew up in the 40s and 50s. Like my grandfather graduated high school in 1955, right? A George McFly kind of character. But they got married in the 60s, right? So free love, that kind of thing. The rebellion of the sexual rebellion and free love. And that largely pertained to sex and that kind of thing. And they got married and had kids, and it was very much a nuclear family. But that particular way of thinking about sexuality was still something that they lived through. And even many, many years later, when my mom had my brothers and I, they kind of impressed some of that stuff onto me. My grandfather would read me H.P. Lovecraft, for instance, just for fun, you know? And there were various other things that were being shown to me at a young age just because I was precocious, and I always thought that's just how it was. And then I discovered, you know, just in elementary school and middle school, high school, no, most people aren't like my grandparents. And that being said, I didn't feel like I totally fit in with my grandparents either, because, again, I'm knowing what I know now. Back then, I was trans and neurodivergent, but it was never something that was brought up in my house growing up. My grandparents, you know, never said, "Oh, we think you're autistic." They just said I was brilliant. And here's the thing. Being autistic is a neurodivergent condition, not an illness. And it's also a spectrum. There are different degrees and qualities of being autistic. And I don't know exactly what it is, but for instance, I have a photographic memory. It's not that I have total recall and I can picture things like perfectly and just draw them with like photographic detail, but I can remember things very, very easily and make connections in terms of, say, a quote from a book. I can't just quote the page numbers and the contents on the page verbatim, but I can remember the position inside the book, open up the page, and find the quote very easily. And it doesn't mean that I don't annotate, like, it's still necessary for me to do that, but there is a degree of neurodivergency to the way that I think that affects my thinking in a very photographic kind of way. And I remember things very, very, very vividly, and it's so vivid that I have to spell it out from beginning to end, almost like a film reel. And I'm not very good at summarizing things, and instead it is something that I have to do more. I'm going to try and tell you how I feel, and even though I could give you the short version, like, I feel bad, and just give you a 3-word response, I'm like, no, that won't work. That doesn't really explain how I feel at all. But then in trying to do it, sometimes I can alienate people because it's difficult for me to be concise. You know, it's like I have to make all these connections, and even right now, trying to explain to you what it's like being trans, what it's like being on the spectrum, I feel like the best way to do it is just show you how I am every day. And it's not a bad thing. I don't mind it. I wouldn't trade who I am for the world. But you do have to meet people that can handle that kind of thing. And a lot of people in high school, for instance, didn't. They thought I was different. But nobody ever really got close. And I, of course, was a horny teenager who, while I read a lot about sexuality, and I had, you know, the basic understanding of, like, consent, like, you know, no means no, tip your sex workers, don't hit a girl, that kind of thing. But as far as relating to people emotionally and knowing how to actually have a relationship with someone, I don't really think anyone at that age is really prepared. But at the same time, mainstream media feeds kids a lot of coercive myths and teaches them or prescribes certain behaviors that are just really fucked up. And my mom, for instance, was we were listening to music videos from the 80s, and there was this one particular song, Jesse's Girl, for instance, and the lyrics are super, super fucked up in that song. Jesse is a friend. Yeah, I know he's been a good friend of mine, but lately something's changed that ain't hard to define. Jesse's got himself a girl, and I want to make her mine. And she's watching him with those eyes, and she's loving him with that body, I just know it. And yeah, he's holding her in his arms late at night. I just wish that I had Jesse's girl. I just wish that I had Jesse's girl. Where can I find a woman like that? And so, on one hand, I was trying to figure out the puzzle of who I was with inadequate information, a total absence of trans terminology, and a total absence of language dealing with what it meant to be autistic. People just described me as different. And yet, at the same time, I kept running into people after high school, I'd say like 18, 20 years old, where high school had sucked and I had a huge problem fitting in, but my way of thinking was informed by songs like Jesse's Girl, or Romeo and Juliet, or something like that, where I always thought Romeo was kind of a psycho, but I also got compared to him a lot, and because I was always unrequited, I was always on the outside looking in. Even when I was in an undergrad in college, pushing 30, and there was this Renaissance poem that we studied, Astrophel and Stella, where Astrophel is kind of on the outside looking in, and sort of talking about this woman very much the same way that Rick Springfield is talking about Jesse's Girl, on the outside looking in. It's a coveting, possessive kind of love, and that's very common in Western civilization and society, going back hundreds of years into the present, and especially how conservatives view that kind of thing nostalgically. Oh, the 80s were a better time because you could act like the singer or the speaker in the poem Jesse's Girl, where this is the cool thing because it speaks to how we feel. And see how the song sort of essentializes it? And it's like, yeah, this is normal. You're supposed to feel this way. When in point of fact, you shouldn't feel this way. If you feel this way, you need to change the way you're thinking, because Jesse's Girl is a person with a name and they have basic human rights, and it's actually you being a really bad friend. I'll play along with the charade. There doesn't seem to be a reason to change. I feel so dirty when they start talking cute. I want to tell her that I love her, but the point is probably moot. Like, the singer, the speaker of the poem and the song is perfidious. They're putting up a front and they're acting cool, but they're also acting, friendly. So they're being a bad friend, and they're treating Jesse's Girl like a possession. They don't even know her name. And it's also a very homosocial kind of relationship between two cishet dudes who are treating this girl like a sex object. And it's like, okay, well, change all that. It's easy for me to sort of break the song down now and analyze it. And point in fact, I'm writing a book right now about this type of material, just in terms of like how are kids conditioned, not just kids, but adults, because it's reinforced cross-generationally, but also within one generation from beginning to end. People are taught how to be men, how to be women in a very like cishet kind of way. It's called compulsory heterosexuality, heteronormativity. These are different terms, but they relate to one another. The idea that sex is enforced, it's expected, it's normal, you're supposed to get married, supposed to have kids. My brothers all did that. Well, two of my brothers. I have an identical twin, and they're married with kids, and my younger brother is also married with kids, So just getting married and having kids, settling down, starting a family, that is conservative because it's, pushed through conservative propaganda all the time. And when I say propaganda, I just mean mainstream media, really. Songs like Jesse's Girl, for instance. So, this kind of thing is very easy for me to discuss now, but, in high school, I didn't have the language. Like, I had the basic sex education, but I also just didn't fit in because I was neurodivergent, and I also felt not as heterosexual as you might think, but again, I didn't know it at the time. There were boys in high school that I thought were cute. I wanted to kiss. Like, I would just be like in class daydreaming about kissing various boys that I thought were cute. But I never thought of it as gay, necessarily. I just thought, he seems kind of cute. And just being like, I want to kiss them. That kind of thing. I never talked about it because I didn't have anyone to talk to about it with, And yet I was still having these thoughts. And then I used to write fantasy stories where there was a goblin named Glenn, inspired by Chrono Trigger, where the human boy is turned into a frog who grows up to be a knight. And in my story, Glenn is a goblin who's kind of short, has a sort of a chicken kind of neck and a giant old man's head with a squashed nose and a pot belly and these long gangly arms and sort of like frog-like fingers. Think like a house elf or something like that, conventionally unattractive, almost sort of like a cross between a baby and an old man, and a monster. And they had a really, really big penis. And I was very, very hypersexual, still am, but my stories were very sexually charged because I was introduced to like Conan the Barbarian by Ron Howard, for instance, and the artwork of Frank Frazetta, so very much that sexual kind of fantasy of the 1930s that was revived in the 1960s and 70s with like swords and sorcery films, Amazon's Conan the Barbarian in 1981, I believe, with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And like by the time John Milius directed Conan the Barbarian, like that was not a new genre by any stretch. I mean, Conan the Barbarian, the stories and that he wrote and the paperbacks that were published and republished, that started in the 30s. So Conan was already sort of an old character at this point, but kind of immortal all the same. Like Batman or Spider-Man. It's designed to be someone that you can recreate and tell over and over and over. And in any event, I, in terms of my sexuality wasn't just informed by pop culture, but also stuff that was a little bit more fantastical or in the margins. And I would write these fantasy stories that reflected trans ideas, even though I had zero exposure to queer media. And the closest I can think of is maybe I saw a movie called American Beauty with Kevin Spacey, where his military neighbor had sort of a kiss don't tell approach to homosexuality, and he ends up shooting Kevin Spacey because Kevin Spacey in the movie isn't about that kind of thing, which is really ironic because in real life he's queer. He's also a pedophile, which is really unfortunate because he gives gay people a bad name because he is very much queer. It's not something that people necessarily talked about openly, but it was sort of an open secret. But he also, from what I understand, was abused himself, and that idea of sort of repressing sexuality, like his father was very abusive and didn't want him to be gay, and that led him to be an abuser himself. And it's unfortunate because the stereotype of the pedophile gay man, that's very much something that is a trope in popular stories, not just because of Kevin Spacey, but he embodies the worst of that kind of thing. But that was like the only exposure I had to that, or something like Silence of the Lambs. They didn't have transgender people wasn't really a term that I actually found out about until I was in grad school, really. I dated someone as an undergrad in 2014 who identified as gender fluid, so a non-binary approach to things. But in terms of transgender as a term, I didn't find out about that until 2017 when an ex of mine in grad school taught me the language. But until then, like through the early 2000s, the 2010s, until about, grad school. Yeah, nearly, 3 years away from 2020. I didn't know any of the language really, and yet I knew people who were trans. I knew people who were different in that way, and I knew people who were autistic because after graduating high school, I kept moving away from heteronormativity as it was expressed to me, despite being hypersexual, despite being someone who was on the spectrum, and despite being someone who very much was inside a trans egg that wanted to hatch. I didn't have the language for it, but kept bumping into people, and I'd meet people on the bus, I'd meet people online. The rise of the internet, for instance, as a public sort of place to meet people. I would meet people on Skype, I would meet people on Steam, back when Steam was a place where people would go and talk, various chat rooms, but also just in person, like on the bus, in class, where people, I would be talking with them for like 15, 20 minutes, and then they'd be like, oh, I'm autistic, or, oh, I'm gay, or I'm bisexual, or I think someone may have told me that they were transgender, but I remember not really retaining the term, and yet around the same time I had an adopted cousin who was originally, their dead name was a female dead name, and then they changed their name to a male name, and they were a trans man. And this happened in the early 2000s, like really before the lingo was out there and more popularized, because it was more mainstream, and as a result of the internet. Well, this was before that, and my cousin came out, and it was very, very difficult for me to figure that out at first, and then eventually I got the hang of it. But it took practice, because not only did I have to practice their new name, but I had to practice with thinking about gender as something that could change. And being exposed to these things and meeting people who were, on the spectrum, or who were, in the LGBT community, I kept bumping into them, and I kept being attracted towards them, but almost like I was fumbling around in the dark and towards a light source, something I was attracted like a moth to a flame. And despite, having certain tendencies that were trans as a teenager, writing about Glenn, and I never got to that point about Glenn, they could change into, from the body of basically a goblin, a male goblin with a very, very large penis, they could transform into a beautiful teenage girl. And at the time, this was juvenilia, but my stories were very, very sexually charged, and I was writing about these various sexual exploits between different characters in fantasy scenarios. Like there was a prince, and the servant was this goblin from another dimension, Glenn, who would transform into a female kind of body, but also gender, like in terms of their gender, the way they identified, the way they spoke, the clothes that they wore. They were very femme, and they had a very, very deep kind of voice, though, because the character was also inspired by Elphaba from Wicked, that came out in the 90s. I want to say 95, 96 maybe, but Elphaba was a green skinned character who had kind of a raspy, gravelly voice, and Glenn was kind of like that. Like they could transform, but they couldn't get rid of their green skin, and they couldn't get rid of their voice. So a leopard can't change its spots, that kind of thing. But the whole idea behind that sort of trans identity, and that ability to change one's sex, but also one's gender, and perform in very different ways. Because there's biological sex, there's sexual orientation, there's gender identity and gender performance. And I was playing around with all of these things in a fantastical way, admittedly, when I was a teenager. But then I started meeting people online, people who were trans, people who were on the spectrum, the neurodivergent spectrum, and discovering that I had something in common with them and I could share my stories with them. But it wasn't until like very, very recently, after I came out as trans a couple of months ago, a couple of weeks ago, when I was writing about sexuality, where I realized sexuality and gender and my own experiences, you know, reflecting on those, I was like, how long have I been trans? And honestly, since I was a teenager at least, and I started experiencing these things, but honestly, probably before that even. And now that's not to say that I don't have certain, like heteronormative kind of types. You know, I prefer like PIV sex, for instance. But I, at the same time, I'm demi-pan. Demi in the sense of I have relationships, sexual relationships with people that I empathize with, that I feel romantically attached to, a closeness to. And I'm attracted to people regardless of their gender, and I'm a trans woman myself, and that's how I identify. And how I perform is, well, my gender performance is very much, I've had a difficulty putting thought into clothing, putting thought into sort of expression. I can do it, but it's generally something I do with people that I feel comfortable with. I'm much more comfortable talking about these things academically, but as far as gender performance and stuff like that, it's not something that I'm just able to do. I kind of feel shy at the moment, actually, about it. But maybe I'll save that for another video. Just suddenly I feel kind of self-conscious. It's like it basically took me, you know, years of slowly discovering more and more about myself, and my trans egg slowly started to crack. But it wasn't until very recently that I thought back and reflected on it and began to associate my past self, before my egg had hatched, as being trans. I was trans all along. I just hadn't found the language for it until I was 31 in grad school. And then I learned about, you know, what it meant to be transgender, to be genderqueer, to be non-binary, terms like that. And they were being introduced to me in an academic kind of way that actually helped explain things from someone who was non-binary themselves. And we were having a relationship, a sexual relationship, where they were teaching me things. And that made a huge difference. And other friends that I made along the way, I started keeping friends, and I could come out to them and tell them more about myself. And then in 2019, my relationship with my ex from grad school ended, and I met someone else shortly thereafter, about 6 months later, and this person seemed really cool, and I was totally myself at this point. And to the point, on our first kind of like date, I guess you could call it, I was being myself to the point that they told me, this person's weird as hell, I like it. And this person is another ex of mine, and they wound up being really abusive, but at the time I was so idiosyncratic and so much being myself that it was actually attractive to them. And honestly, they were very idiosyncratic themselves, and I was attracted to them too. They're gender fluid, at least they were, and you know, sexuality and gender are fluid, so you can sort of, you know, move back and forth between things. Neurodivergency is not fluid. It's just how your brain is. Like, so me being born precociously literate, for instance, and having a college reading level at the age of, you know, I don't know, 8, that was not something that was taught. That's not something that I just decided I would do. It's how I was born. And my orientation, as far as me being pan, there are constants and variables, and as time goes on, I think orientation is something that is a little bit more set in stone. It's something that you can discover along the way, and I think a lot of people aren't really encouraged to experiment and explore sexually. They're supposed to have cishet relationships, get married, and have kids. And even people who are in the closet, gay men will get beards, for instance. Or I guess gay women, can they get beards too? I'm not entirely sure about that particular term, but the idea that, homonormativity, gay people being in the closet, blending in, or even if they're not in the closet, but they still fulfill the parent role, that kind of thing. It's definitely something that you can do, but then there are people who are more transgressive, and as time goes on, like for instance, I'm demi-pan, and I'm very much about oral sex, for instance, oral sex on AMAB people, assigned male at birth, so oral sex, where I'm giving oral sex, and that type of thing, and it's sex with a penis, non-vaginal sex, basically, and that can be anal, that can be oral, and it's something that I discovered, and I think I was always kind of curious about what you would call like bi-curious or gay-curious, that kind of thing, but it's not something that I actively explored until 2 relationships after grad school, actually. So I met someone in grad school who taught me about the ways of trans people and non-binary people, and they taught me the lingo. And then I met someone after that who taught me about BDSM and separate from like sexuality, like what they call power exchange. And then after those relationships, I had a fling with someone, and that person taught me more about gender expression. And they were a bit younger than me, so they were in their early 20s, and I was 35, 36 at that point, so definitely an age difference. But they taught me more about how to perform in terms of being like transgender, trans femme, trans masc, that kind of thing, so sort of non-binary language, more from the point of view of someone from a different generation, and that helped me experiment more. And I learned for instance, when I was in the relationship before them, I was in a threesome, and it was 2 AMABs with 1 AFAB, so 2 dudes and 1 girl, just if you're speaking in cishet language. And I tried oral sex on the guy, and it was not that bad. And incidentally, I had an experience before college, the second time around, so like in 2014, 2013, where somebody had told me that sucking on a dick is kind of like sucking on a thumb. And I remember having that threesome and being like, oh my god, they weren't kidding, that's not so bad. And then I had all of these sort of childish cishet heteronormative phobias about penises, like homo suspicion, or oh no, the penis is scary, or butt sex, that kind of thing, surprise butt sex, just all these memes, or the gay hobbits from Clerks 2, that I grew up just being surrounded by that kind of shit when I was in high school, and even before high school, honestly. And discovering that it was all stupid, and there was actually nothing to be afraid of, and it opened my eyes. And then suddenly I started seeking out people who are, morphologically different than what I was accustomed to. I still have preferences. I still prefer vaginal sex, for instance, but there are some cute boys out there. I definitely am a little more picky when it comes to boys, but at the same time, it's something that I learned to appreciate. The penis and the anus are things to appreciate. They're not just these abject sites of fear that you have to reject in a very heteronormative kind of way. And it has really made a difference, though, having friends like that, having relationships and experimenting. And eventually my trans egg cracked and I came out and I said, fuck it. And I had thought about doing it before going to Florida 2 years ago. And I had wanted to come out with that person, the one who taught me about BDSM. I said, hey, why can I come out? And, I want to start identifying differently. And then they actually discouraged me from doing that. And it turns out that they were actually a TERF and a SWERF, so trans exclusionary radical feminist, a sex work exclusionary radical feminist, and they were a neoliberal, so they were actually a really bad fit. But that's not really something you talk about on the first date. We were both just like down to fuck, and I kind of ignored certain red flags and got myself involved in a relationship where I was being abused by someone who was more cis-conforming and supremacist than I realized, because at that point there was the whole J.K. Rowling scandal, and they were like defending J.K. Rowling and talking about like bi erasure by pan people and how they would more often than not actually present as cisgendered, or if they weren't cisgendered, they would act, kind of butch, that kind of thing. So there are different degrees of turfdom, but they definitely, and they liked cute boys, that kind of thing, but they abused the shit out of me. So, it's messy, and they definitely had certain things that they were cool about, but needless to say, I didn't feel comfortable coming out with them or coming out to the world for that matter, because I was being abused by them and trying to figure that out, trying to survive. And when I got out of that relationship and I had an affair, I guess it was kind of an affair, whatever, fuck it, I don't care. It was at the very, very end of our relationship. I got involved with someone else, and that's not why I broke up with my ex. They were abusing me really badly, and when I called them out on that, they threw me out. I said, hey, I feel like you're being abusive, and the moment I said that, they're like, okay, your ass is out of here. And that sucked. But then they dropped me off to stay with someone, and someone that I had been wanting to have sex with, and that person was younger, and I learned more about myself through them, where they were teaching me about terms like transgender and transfemme and how to perform that way from a younger point of view. They were using these terms more intuitively, and they had a trans egg themselves. Like, they didn't start performing in a trans kind of way until they were 19, 20, something like that. But then they really, really leaned into it. And by the time I met them, they were teaching me all kinds of things. They taught me the ways of love. And, at that point I was already pretty experienced, but every relationship I'm in, I learned something new, something exciting. And I learned to appreciate anal sex, for instance, when I was with this person. I was like, ew. When I was in grad school, I was actually kind of grossed out by it, despite the fact that my partner at the time was really into it, and I wasn't. And I thought, okay. But then 2 relationships later, I'm with this person, and I'm like, hell yeah, anal's actually quite a bit of fun. It's not what I do normally, but, it's something different, something to break up the monotony of just plain Jane PIV missionary sex. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. And I'm certainly not afraid of it, like the way my brothers are, or the way that it's complicated, right? Because cis supremacy, heteronormativity, that kind of thing, tends to champion fears about gay men having anal sex. But if a husband has anal sex with his wife, then hey, whatever, who gives a shit? Everybody does that. If the river runs red, take the dirt path instead. Which I also never understood, being afraid of having oral sex with someone who's on their period, like whatever, it's just blood. But that type of thing is these types of experiences, and letting go of my fears and learning to be more myself. The more I let go of these heteronormative beliefs that were kind of impressed upon me from a very early age just through popular media, I started to feel more comfortable just being myself and trying different things. And that doesn't mean that I don't have preferences. I absolutely do. I have preferences about a lot of things, just in terms of, I tend to be less picky when it comes to AFAB partners, and just because I find a lot more body types attractive. Like if someone's plus size, if someone's thick, if they're a little bit, if they're tall, short, if they have big boobs, little boobs. I'm more of an ass girl myself. Like, I definitely prefer the booty over the boobies, but I also think about and draw a lot of these things in a purely asexual kind of way. And I'm like, yeah, those are some nice boobies, even though I'm not like super into them. And even when I'm having sex, it's like the butt has a much more euphoric, erotic, immediate, knee-jerk kind of effect on me than boobs do. But it doesn't mean that they're not nice to look at when I'm drawing them or when having sex, honestly. Or if somebody's just walking around the house and they have like a low-cut shirt, or they're like, hey, check this out, and then they just squeeze their boobs together, and it's just silliness. It's just flirting, you know. It's not like not necessarily an invitation to fuck, though it oftentimes would lead to that. Sometimes it was just like, oh, boobies, yay, you know. And so as far as all of that goes, I definitely it helped me getting away from my comfort zone, which includes the land of my birth, you know, getting away from Michigan, going overseas, traveling, talking with people in faraway places. I know that there's the trope of the gay person is the unicorn, the trans person is a unicorn, that kind of thing. But really, they're all over the place. But I did have to travel to a faraway mystical land, Manchester, England, to find someone who I was really compatible with. I had a relationship before that, but I was 29 when I had my first relationship. I had sex before, but the sex was always with sex workers. So I lost my virginity when I was 21, Christmas, I believe. And I didn't have my first relationship out in the wild until I was 29, and I met this girl on the bus. They went to the community college, I went to the university, I was on the same route, we lived in the same town. They were 20, I was 29, that kind of thing. And so definitely younger than me. And the first time I saw them on the bus, they were smiling. They just seemed like they were smiling all the time, and I was in a bad mood. And I was struggling to be more social. I was introverted, and I was just stressed out because, well, I was 29 and I was single, and I was also living away from home, or I was commuting. It was a 4-hour commute to school, so anybody's going to be pissed off if you're doing a 4-hour commute. And but I remember seeing them and being like, what the hell is this person's problem? But then eventually we started to talk and gravitate towards each other, and I ended up having a relationship with them briefly, but it was a legitimate, bona fide relationship in the wild. I had my first kiss, that proverbial first kiss with someone that you're attracted to. It's not prompted, just straight out of the movies, you know. Same idea with the sex, you know. And the stories I could tell about that kind of thing. And it feels nice to be able to say that I had those experiences, because every experience taught me more about myself, taught me to be more responsible, taught me how to relate to people emotionally. And I'm not saying you can't put that in a book, and honestly, that's what I'm trying to communicate in my own writing. But at the same time, in order to really learn about people, you can't necessarily learn it in a book exactly. Like, you have to learn it by doing it. I think that's definitely the best way. And because people are different, you know, every relationship that I've been in has been different. And I've learned different things about myself and about other people through these relationships that I've had, one after another. And of course, I'm poly too, so not only am I demi-pan, but I'm poly, and and that is something that I actually learned about before after my first relationship. I met someone as an undergrad who was gender fluid and poly, and they taught me about that, and it was a very brief sort of thing with them. Don't sleep with your flatmates, kids. And I say that, and yet I'm happy I did, because I slept with, I was living in an efficiency, and I slept with this person, and it didn't end up working out, and it was really awkward. But then when I was in grad school, I did the same thing, and although the relationship didn't work out then, we're still friends 5 years later. So, hey, I'll take it, you know? And I learned a shitload, and they helped me actually meet my next partner. And, you know, they taught me how to date and use different websites and date online, basically. I was already kind of doing it, but they showed me a few tricks. I met my next partner after that, and I ended up moving to Florida and staying there for 2 years. I saw crocodiles and shit. Alligators, sorry, not crocodiles. I always got them confused. Lots of gators, though. Lots of gators, and this person was a entomologist, so they knew a shitload about bugs, and every time we went for a walk, we'd see wolf spiders, we'd see silk moths. The females they called flying sausages because of the eggs in their bodies, that kind of thing. And in any event, it was an adventure. Even though that person ended up abusing me really badly, I still was a good time, part of the time. You know, it was very, very stressful, but it also taught me what to look out for, you know. Yes, pay attention to those red flags, you know. And I tried to communicate and everything about myself, like, look, I'm poly, I'm an erotic artist, I'm a communist, but it didn't matter at that particular point. But every time I'm in a new relationship, I learn something new, and I feel like holistically I have a much better grasp of things than I did when I was, say, 20 years old. And to the point that, you know, I have a very firm grasp of academic theory, but also applying that theory, praxis, right, to my social life. And that kind of brings me to my last point. I wanted to bring things back around, away from gender and sexuality, to being on the spectrum. And I actually had an experience just last night where I was really, really stressed out with some stuff, and I was spending time with a friend, and something had happened, and I was really worried about my living situation, and there was some family drama, and I was trying to reach out to different members of my support group, and they all reached out to me at the same time, and and my partner reached out to me, my current partner, and I was like, oh shit, I'm being pulled in all these different directions. 1 second, I just gotta change the music. Let's see. Okay, so different. I'm gonna put the Black Sabbath back on. Or Jazz Sabbath. So, I was going through this experience where I was just totally like being pulled in all these different directions, and I was starting to feel like super overwhelmed. And in the past, I would get panic attacks, but I never really thought that much about it. Like, I'm like, okay, I'm having a panic attack, but that's just because, I don't know, I'm an isolated genius, and I'm just overwhelmed. But I didn't think about it in terms of me being on the spectrum, me being neurodivergent. I just thought, okay, I'm stressed out about going to grad school, for instance, and I was sitting on this rock on campus at my alma mater, and I was crying because I was just so overwhelmed. And I was actually relating to King Lear for some reason when he's on the heath during the storm. And I was like, okay, that doesn't seem right. But it felt really appropriate too. And so I would always sort of relate to the characters of like Shakespearean plays who had like really, really, really high emotional points and really, really, really low emotional points. And to me, that just seemed normal. Like, it made sense emotionally. But there were a lot of kids well, a lot of adults in class, because at that point, I was actually the old man in the classroom. I hadn't come out yet, so I was the old man at the time. I was the old girl in the classroom, and I was in my 30s at that point, and a lot of the students, even at my alma mater at the university I went to Eastern Michigan University. Most of the undergrads there were in their 20s, and that would happen again actually when I was in grad school, where the grad students tended to be younger because they would get out of their secondary education when they were like K through 12 for them, or whatever the British equivalent of that, ends at 16. So you would have, if you had precocious grad students, they'd be like 21, 22 years old. So in grad school, same idea. I was 31, and there were grad students who were like 21, 22 years old when I was at Manchester. So very much constantly feeling like I never really fit in, even in grad school. Also, I was an American at a British university, totally different teaching style, and I tend to be very, very open about like my sexuality and stuff, and that created some interesting tensions and dramas, but never anything like illicit or criminal, but just like I tended to be really sort of open about things. Though I remember we were talking about Ira Levin's Rosemary's Baby, and Lenny Blake, the head of the Gothic program, was talking about Satan's big cock, and how Satan's big cock, according to Ira Levin, Ira seemed to imply that Satan's giant cock had made Rosemary orgasm, for instance, even though people can orgasm or have like a physical, like orgasmic response to sex, but not really feel that way about it, like emotionally, and they can be somewhat indifferent to it. Like, you can be ace and still have an orgasm. You can be a victim of sexual abuse and still respond to it physically. But I remember kind of talking about that kind of stuff, and sometimes I talk about my own sexuality, and that made for some interesting conversations in and outside of the classroom, but all in good fun at the end of the day. It's like I lived through it. I graduated, I got my master's, and but I used to feel like I never fit in, and that I would be really, really awkward. I was trying to be myself, but I felt like there was this cognitive kind of estrangement between me and my colleagues, and just grad students. A lot of them tended to be younger. The ones who were the same age as me, though I didn't always fit in with, and some of my professors too. Like, I remember Lenny Blake trying to tell me that, oh, depression is just when you feel sad. No, that's not what depression is at all. But they were definitely older than me. They're in their 50s, I want to say. So they're definitely a couple decades older than me in any case. And I remember feeling like I didn't fit in. But I never really thought about it like, okay, I'm on the spectrum, despite the fact that I kept bumping into people who were and telling me that they were. But I would get panic attacks and be like, okay, I'm just having a panic attack. Because my mom, being bipolar, she would have a panic attack, so I knew what the language was for that. But then a couple of nights, like literally last night, I was talking with a friend, and they had told me that they thought I might be neurodivergent, but then suddenly, when I'm being pulled in all these different directions at once, and I'm really, really stressed out, and I'm talking with them, they're a part of my support group. We were supposed to hang out and just, like, we were going to watch Derek Jarman's Caravaggio, because I wanted to introduce them to Derek Jarman, because my ex in grad school had shown me Derek Jarman, and, this gay filmographer's relationship with Tilda Swinton, and The Last of England, and that's how I learned to hate Margaret Thatcher, for instance. And so I wanted to show my friend this last night, and we had planned to have, just like a movie date kind of thing, like hey, let's watch Caravaggio, and but instead I was like super stressed out, and I was being pulled in all these different directions. Different people were messaging me all at once, and I was also really stressed out about some like money shit, some family shit, and I was like, ugh. And I was trying to explain it, and it kind of sounded like this video, just sort of rambling and wending. And my friends told me, they're like, you sound exactly like our mutual friend who is autistic. And when they talk about things and they're sort of describing it almost like photographically, and it's just like super vivid, but it's also going from beginning to end like a fuse burning. And there's no way for you to skip ahead, and you just have to explain it, and you're just writing out the emotions. And I was like, oh my God, I think you're right. And that was the first time in my life last night where I actually felt like, yeah, okay. Am I neurodivergent? Sure. No, I think because they didn't just say neurodivergent. They said, you're like our mutual friend who's autistic. And it makes sense, though. It's like the autistic spectrum, the neurodivergent spectrum, allows for different degrees of that, because I do have friends who are autistic, and I never felt like exactly like them. But at the same time, I never felt like I was normal either. And as far as that goes, talking with my friends and them telling me that they thought, you sound like our autistic mutual friend. And I'm like, oh my God, yeah, you're absolutely right. And then I started to think of myself as not just neurodivergent or not just different, but autistic. And having the language for that has allowed me to feel much more comfortable in terms of setting boundaries, who I relate to, who I don't talk to, knowing who's going to understand, who isn't, finding my people, as it were. And that's just made a huge difference. But I'm 36, and while I have watched my trans egg crack since I was about 16, 17, since high school, the neurodivergent kind of thing, I always thought of myself as just like a genius, that kind of thing. But I never really thought of myself as autistic, and that all changed last night thanks to various friends that I had, and someone who was willing to sort of listen to me and who felt comfortable with me being me, and who not only wasn't going to judge me, but actually preferred me this way. All it took was someone like that telling me, hey, I think you might be autistic. And they're like, I mean this in the kindest way possible. I mean this entirely a positive way. This isn't a bad thing. So they prefaced it and everything. And I'm like, okay, what do you mean? And because the last time they were talking with me like that, prefacing it almost like a trigger warning, they said they compared me to Jordan Peterson, but they're like, you're the photo negative opposite of Jordan Peterson, because he starts crying about like stupid shit, whereas when you start crying, you're crying about like human rights abuses and stuff like that. So I was kind of anxious actually at first when they told me, what are you gonna tell me? And then when they told me what it was, and you're like, but I was also like really keyed at this point, like I was like super on edge, so I'm like, oh, okay, please don't tell me something that's gonna make this worse. And then when they told me, I was like, it was actually kind of a relief, like, oh my God, yeah, I think you're right. Oh yeah, no, totally. Like this feeling that I'm having, because I've been watching more shows that have autistic characters in them, like Heartbreak High, that has a relationship between a trans character and a friendship between a trans character and a person who's autistic. And having that to compare to, and it's only something that I watched recently with my mother, and watching that with them, and then having my friend tell me, I think you're autistic, and then taking that, being in a heightened emotional state where I'm just like, and then thinking about that relative to that show, Heartbreak High, and comparing myself to Quinny, I believe her name was, and being like, oh my God, yeah, I totally fucking think you're right. Wow, holy fucking shit. But it's cool. It's like, yeah, fuck yeah, yeah, I don't mind being that. I don't want to be, I've never been normal. So having the language to describe that, and having like things to compare that to, relative to my own experiences, and not just saying, oh, I'm having a panic attack, but relative to what? Well, I get panic attacks, or I get overwhelmed emotionally, but also just how I conduct myself. in a very jazz-like kind of way, where everything intersects and there's no discretion, and trying to find boundaries within that and learning how to communicate with people like me. Having the language to be able to work with that is tremendously liberating, and learning how to relate to people, form boundaries, and think about myself in a way that I never have. So me coming out as trans, I did that a couple of months ago, and it's like I want to, I don't know if people come out for being autistic too, but I feel like it's not something that is always talked about publicly, because autistic people are generally viewed as like mentally ill, and that's just not the case. Einstein was on the autistic spectrum. Glenn Gould was on the autistic spectrum. I'm fairly certain a lot of people are. Neurodivergency tends to be comorbid with various mental disorders, but also mental like syndromes or things that result from like trauma from being abused, because neurodivergent people tend to be treated like shit. But then they also might have various comorbidities like ADHD or bipolar disorder or borderline disorder. So there are things that are hereditary, and there are things that are resulting from external trauma. And as far as that goes, it's definitely there's a tremendous stigma with being autistic, with being neurodivergent, and so yeah, I guess this is my coming out video as far as that goes too. But in any event, yeah, these are just kind of my thoughts about that, and in terms of what it's like to be trans, what it's like to be autistic, and to slowly realize that and have these life-changing revelations or epiphanies thanks to my friends, people that I've gravitated towards over the years, telling me this, pointing it out. It seems obvious now, but at the time I just didn't have the language for it. And having people tell me, I think you might be this or that, I'm like, oh my god, you're absolutely right. For all my genius, supposedly, I wasn't able to figure that out, and it took someone else telling me. Someone who had the courage to do that, but also doing it in a way that it wasn't hurtful, where I would reject it. Makes a big difference. In any event, I'm going to cut this video off here, I think. I appreciate it if you sat through the whole thing. It's meant to be kind of unscripted, to illustrate what it's to see things through my eyes. If only you could see what I've seen with your eyes. And to be able to show people that by really being myself. My videos have always kind of been like this, but just kind of describing things like in the language that I speak every day. This is my truth. This is my language. And this is my experience as a trans neurodivergent person. So, thanks for listening.